Mogadishu, 1994. The city didn't feel alive so much as like a wounded predator, watching every movement with a bright, feverish intensity. Heat pressed down from above, while rising from the broken earth below, trapping everything between layers of suffocating air, heavy with dust, exhaust, and the distant, perpetual sputter of gunfire that never fully faded. Mogadishu wasn't a battlefield, it was a living maze engineered by desperation, hunger, fractured loyalties, and warlords who ruled each neighborhood according to their own brutal arithmetic. It was in the middle of this tense, shifting landscape that a Navy SEAL codenamed Cole found himself utterly and impossibly alone. He hadn't been lost. He hadn't been abandoned. He had simply been swallowed. 5 days earlier, Cole had landed with a joint reconnaissance team, tasked with something deceptively straightforward: identify and document a weapons corridor funneling arms into one of the most violent militias in the city. The operation was meant to be quick, 24 hours in Tuttle always, with a team nearby, always within radio range, always with a clean extraction on standby. But Mogadishu was governed by its own rules. Rules written not by treaties or strategy, but by rumor, instinct, and blood. On the second night, those rules rewrote the entire mission in the blink of an eye. A market explosion, a rerouted convoy, and a militia ambush that spread like an electrical surge through the South District shattered the Team S formation. In the chaos, Cole was separated from the others. His radio went silent, maybe jammed, maybe broken, maybe both. His backup route collapsed under enemy fire, and the extraction zone was overrun before his team could regroup. Under relentless pressure, the rest of the unit was forced to retreat miles away, scattered into pockets of resistance and silence. Cole, trained to expect uncertainty, but never abandonment, suddenly became a single operator, cut loose inside a city that didn't forgive mistakes. When dawn rose the following morning, the streets around him transformed. Doors remained closed, windows became dark, hollow eyes, and the alleys stretched like the throats of predators waiting for him to step inside. Cole carried only the essentials strapped to his body: a suppressed MP5 to spare magazines, a combat knife, a radio that hissed static like a snake, refusing to speak, a map growing more useless by the hour, and the hard-earned awareness that if anyone identified him as American, his life expectancy would shrink 2 minutes. He navigated Mogadishu with the deliberate caution of someone moving barefoot across broken glass. Every movement, every glance upward, every pause to study a doorway carried the weight of survival. Cole had been trained to fight, to infiltrate, to escape, and to kill when necessary, but Mogadishu demanded something far more intricate. It demanded that he evaporate into the landscape, that he stop existing without dying. By the afternoon of the first day, Cole understood the brutal truth that would define the next 5. Here, violence wasn't an event, it was geography. The ambushes weren't anomalies, they were seasonal. Survival wasn't tea. A skillet was improvisation, constant and cruel, dictated by the shifting loyalties of neighborhoods and the silent stares of people who decided, moment by moment, whether you were worth letting live. He avoided main roads because they exposed him. He avoided crowds because they were unpredictable. He avoided alleys where children lingered, because in Mogadishu, some children weren't children. They were lookouts paid in scraps to report strangers. He trusted nothing except instinct, that primal sense honed through years of training in deserts, jungles, and kill houses where hesitation had no place. But Mogadishu didn't fear men trained to kill. It consumed them. During the first night, crouched behind the collapsed wall of an abandoned pharmacy, Cole heard the soft shuffle of coordinated footsteps, steady, purposeful. Militia patrol. He pressed himself deeper into the rubble, controlling his breathing, eyes steady in the darkness, as 3 men armed with AKs passed so close he could hear, their fingers brushing against the metal receivers. Their voices drifted through the night, calm and confident, the voices of men who believed the city itself would protect them. Hours later, when it was safe enough to move, he slipped deeper into the ruins, each step a negotiation with the ground beneath him. It was then, in that quiet stretch of darkness, that the full weight of his situation settled into his bones. He was in Tejas, cut off from his team, He wasn't just behind enemy lines. He was 5 days away from becoming another anonymous corpse in a city where bodies were counted but never remembered. But Kolewathan, T-shaped for quiet deaths. He was shaped to adapt, endure, and outthink whatever waited in the darkness. And so alone, underarmed, compared to the militias hunting him, trapped in one of the deadliest grids of Mogadishu. He prepared to survive the next 5 days, the only way a SEAL could buy, turning himself into something the city wouldn't notice until it was too late. What he did next would become a classified lesson in survival, taught quietly behind closed doors. A reminder that some missions aren't defined by the objective you were given, but by the refusal to die before the world is done with you. By the morning of the second day, Cole understood that Mogadishu had already sensed him. Not seen him, not identified, him sensed him. The way a living organism recognizes something foreign inside its bloodstream. The city had an uncanny instinct for strangers, especially those who moved with too much purpose and not enough fear. And Cole felt that instinct tightening around him like a slow, constricting fist. He stayed in the shadows of narrow alleyways, slipping through broken door frames and weaving between collapsed storefronts, each movement silent and deliberate. But even silence has weight, and in Mogadishu, weight drew attention. Near midday, while sheltering behind the rusted carcass of an overturned bus, he overheard voices drifting through the market, one street over, two men speaking quickly in Somali, their tone urgent. Cole couldn't understand every word, but he recognized enough phrases to understand the meaning. Someone had spotted a foreign soldier the night before, and now a bounty had been placed on locating him. Not capturing, just locating. The militias would handle the rest. A cold ripple spread through him. The city wasn't just Anjurosit was now organized in its hunt for him. He stayed low as he moved, avoiding any street where people lingered too long or looked at him for more than a passing moment. Mogadishu had become a chessboard, and every pair of eyes a potential piece the militias could move against him. The worst were the children, boys no older than 12, posted at intersections, pretending to play but watching every new face with the sharp, calculating awareness of lookouts trained by necessity rather than instruction. Their eyes tracked movements with an eerie precision, and Cole knew that if any one of them recognized the cut of his clothing or the cadence of his stride, he wouldn't survive the hour. He rationed his water with brutal discipline. One bottle had shattered during the ambush. The remaining one was now half full, its contents warming quickly in the heat. He took only the smallest sip, letting the liquid sit on his tongue before swallowing. Hydration wasn't about quenching thirst, it was about managing how long the body could endure without collapsing. He had seen men in the desert die, not from dehydration itself, but from panic at the sensation of dryness in their throats. He refused that panic. He swallowed once and moved on. By afternoon, the rhythm of the city changed again. Conversations quieted as he passed. People closed shutters gently instead of slamming them. A group of teenage boys stopped arguing and simply watched him walk by. That was the moment he knew the hunt had begun in earnest. The silence wasn't caution, it was anticipation. He drifted into a labyrinth of narrow alleys that twisted behind a cluster of bombed-out apartment blocks, places where walls were thin and floors had collapsed into themselves. Here, the air felt heavier, thick with smoke and the stagnant smell of places that had burned months ago, but never fully cooled. Cole paused at the entrance of a narrow passage, studying the angles. Something about the space felt wrong. Too still, too quiet, too staged. He turned to retreat and heard the soft scrape of metal. Not the clatter of an AK being readied, not the rattle of a loose magazine. No. This was quieter, more controlled. The slide of a blade against a wall. Cole spun to the right, pressing himself against the broken edge of a doorway, just as a man stepped out from behind a collapsed stairwell with a machete in hand. Another appeared behind him, this one gripping a length of pipe. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Their eyes said everything. They weren't militia. At least not officially. They were opportunists, hyenas drawn to the scent of the bounty. Cole didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, striking first. A suppressed shot cracked through the alley. More a soft cough than a gunfire report. The first man dropped before he understood what had happened. The second rushed him with a shout, swinging the pipe in a wide arc meant to break bone. Cole sidestepped, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted sharply, and drove him headfirst into the wall. The body slumped, motionless. For a moment, everything was still, except for the sound of Cole catching his breath. But stillness in Mogadishu never lasted. Two children stood at the far end of the alley, watching silently, eyes wide. No fear, no surprise. Cole raised a finger to his lips. A futile history, but they didn't run. They didn't shout. They simply stared, unmoving. It was only when Cole slipped deeper into the ruins that he realized what their silence meant. They were not witnesses. They were messengers. By late afternoon, the neighborhoods had shifted again. Men lingered at corners where earlier there had been none. Groups of young fighters lounged on rooftops pretending to be idle, but their rifles angled subtly toward the streets below. It was as if the city had begun to tilt toward him, funneling him inward, herding him down a path chosen not by him but by the collective will of everyone hunting him. As night descended for a second time, Cole found a temporary refuge in the gutted interior of what had once been a doctor's office. The walls were scorched, medical charts half-burned, cabinets overturned. He wedged a rusted metal filing cabinet against the door and crouched behind an examination table, breathing quietly, listening to the rhythm of the city outside. Every sound was magnified: the distant laughter of a militia patrol, the barking of dogs, the hurried footsteps of someone running, the unmistakable metallic clink of a weapon being slung over a shoulder. And then came the sound that tightened every muscle in his body. Footsteps. Slow, measured, searching. They passed directly outside the door, paused, and then continued. Cole held his breath until the night swallowed the footsteps completely, leaving him alone, not with silence, but with the knowledge that the militia was closing in and that the city was beginning to remember where it had seen him. He had survived 2 days. 3 remained, and Mogadishu was only now starting to hunt him in earnest. The second night fell like a weight rather than a sunset, thick and oppressive, as if the darkness itself were tightening around the city's skeleton. Mogadishu did not sleep. It only shifted tone. The chaotic violence of the day gave way to something quieter, more controlled, more deliberate. If daytime was a storm, nighttime was a hunt, and Cole had begun to feel the psychological gravity of being prey. As he crouched inside the burned-out doctor's office, listening to the last echoes of footsteps fade, he forced himself to slow his breathing and take inventory of the growing weakness settling into his body. The heat had drained him relentlessly, and he had taken only 3 shallow sips of water in more than a day. His tongue felt thick, his throat raw, and his muscles ached not from exertion but from dehydration beginning to coil around his system like a tightening vine. He knew the symptoms. He had studied them. He had pushed through them in the controlled brutality of training, where instructors monitored your pulse and water waited behind a curtain. But here, there was no curtain, only a city whose walls radiated heat back into the night, like a furnace that never cooled. He adjusted his gear, feeling the weight of the remaining magazine, and the sheath of his knife against his ribs, grounding himself in the small certainties he still had. But as he shifted, his hand brushed the fabric of his pack, and he remembered the water bottle inside, barely a quarter full. He almost reached for it, but stopped. Not yet. Dawn was too far away. When the streets grew quiet enough to risk moving, Cole eased the filing cabinet away from the door and slipped out into the alley, hugging the deepest shadows as he moved. The moon was thin, barely a sliver, but even its faint silver glow felt like a spotlight on his back. He navigated through the tight arteries of the neighborhood, stepping over rubble, ducking beneath hanging laundry, squeezing through crumbled archways that once belonged to homes now reduced to fractured memories. He could feel Mogadishu watching him in the way a jungle watches the wounded patient, curious, ready. As he approached a wide intersection, the normal nighttime murmur of the city shifted. Voices rose ahead low. Firm, structured Malaya. He crouched behind an overturned cart and listened. The men spoke with the assertiveness of people who thought they were closing in on something important. He recognized the tone before the words. They were discussing the foreigner. They believed he wasn't just a lost soldier. They believed he was carrying something. Documents, maps, intelligence, something they thought was worth hunting. Cole felt a chill crawl down his spine. The narrative around him had transformed. He wasn't simply a man trying to survive. He had become an objective. He waited until the patrol dispersed, then scanned the edges of the intersection. On one corner, a group of teenagers lounged with the casual menace of those who belonged to one faction or another. Boys who had grown up in war and learned to measure danger the way others learned to measure time. Farther down the street, a man smoked a cigarette on a doorstep, glancing up every few seconds with eyes that were far too alert to be innocent. Cole realized he had stepped into a district controlled by a rival militia, one that didn't he work with the faction hunting him, but that didn't he mean. They wouldn't he sell him for a reward or trade him as a bargaining chip. In Mogadishu, neutrality was a myth, and survival was currency. His vision blurred for a moment as dehydration tightened its grip, and he blinked hard, refocusing. He needed water, even a trickle, even the runoff from a broken pipe. He slipped deeper into the district, following the faint sound of dripping that echoed somewhere behind a row of storage shacks. When he reached the source, his heart sunk a cracked pipe, leaking only enough to wet the ground beneath it. Still, he dropped to one knee and pressed 2 fingers to the damp earth, bringing the barely there moisture to his lips. The taste of metal filled his mouth, but it was water, or something close enough to pretend. Pushed on. By the middle of the night, the air grew strangely quiet, not the settling quiet of a neighborhood going to sleep, but the anticipatory quiet of a place waiting for something. Cole moved along the edge of a building, keeping close to the wall. When he saw a movement, Ahida, thin silhouette, crouched near a doorway, motionless, watching the street like a sentinel. Cole froze, his instincts screaming. The figure didn't shift its weight, didn't fidget, didn't turn its head. That meant one thing: train. He retreated a few steps, only to hear a sound behind him, a soft click, the unmistakable metallic whisper of a safety being switched off. He spun to the side, pressing himself against a wall as a shadowed figure slipped out from behind a pile of debris. Another trap, another hunter. Mogadishu wasn't simply pushing him toward danger, it was squeezing him from both sides. He raised his MP5 slowly, intending to neutralize the nearest threat, when a voice barked from across the street. A second militiaman emerged from the shadows, then a third, their movements coordinated but slow, as if they believed they had all the time in the world. Cole swallowed, feeling the dryness tear down his throat. His mind calculated rapidly his ammo, their positions, the angles, the likely reinforcements, the chance of being heard by another squad. None of it looked survivable, and yet survival was the only option. He fired first, a single suppressed shot to the chest of the closest man, who collapsed without a sound. The second lifted his rifle, too slow, and Cole struck him in the throat with a swift, vicious motion before dragging his body into the shadows. The third fired, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the alley with a burst of orange light. Cole ducked behind a shattered doorway, the bullet ricocheting off the stone above his head. He fired twice, clean and controlled, and the alley fell quiet again. But the quiet wasn't a victory. It was a warning. Gunfire even. Suppressed gunfire carried, meaning in Mogadishu. Meaning that traveled fast. He needed to disappear. He moved through the alley, down a broken staircase, into a narrow underpass where the smell of decay lingered thick in the air. His hands trembled from dehydration and adrenaline. His breath came in shallow, controlled bursts. His body was telling him he couldn't keep this up, but his mind refused to surrender. He pushed deeper into the underpass, letting the city swallow him once more. Only when he reached a collapsed courtyard hidden behind layers of concrete did he allow himself to lean against a wall. His head buzzed faintly. His throat felt hollow. His vision trembled at the edges. He had gone too long without rest, too long without water, too long without certainty. And for the first time since the ambush, a thought flickered brief, unwelcome, but real. He might not survive the next day, but he forced the thought down. Survival wasn't a feeling, it was a decision made repeatedly in the dark. He wiped the sweat from his eyes, steadied his breathing, and prepared for the third sunrise he wasn't sure he'd see. By the time the third dawn bled into the sky, a dull gray light settling over the crumbling rooftops of Mogadishu, Cole's body had begun to rebel against him. The night had taken more from him than he realized. When he tried to stand, the ground tilted sideways, and he steadied himself against a wall that felt hotter than his own skin. His legs trembled, not from fear, but from dehydration, scorching its way through his muscles, pulling strength from his bones and leaving behind a hollow ache. His throat had tightened into a dry, cracked channel, each breath scraping like sandpaper. He blinked hard, trying to clear the blurring edges of his vision, but the world swayed in a slow, nauseating circle. He forced himself upright and began moving through the courtyard, one hand brushing the wall for balance. The air tasted metallic, thick with a residue of burned trash and the faint smell of stagnant water he hadn't seen in 2 days. He needed hydration, anything, even something barely drinkable. The body could survive days without food, but without water, Mogadishu would claim him faster than any bullet. He staggered toward a doorway hanging crookedly from its hinges, stepping into a narrow interior room collapsed partly inward. Light spilled through a broken hole in the ceiling, illuminating dust swirling in slow motion. He crouched near an object that glimmered faintly, an old metal basin. When he reached it, his heart sank. Whatever water it once held had long evaporated, leaving only a ring of dirt and a spider skittering across the bottom. He felt a flash of frustration, stopped it, and reminded himself that wasted emotion costs stamina. As he turned toward the exit, the world seemed to pull away from him. A wave of dizziness washed over him so powerfully that he dropped to one knee, catching himself with his palm against the concrete. His breath came shallow and quick. His skin felt cold despite the heat. Black shapes swam at the edges of his vision. He knew what was coming, the body's warning before collapse. He closed his eyes for a moment longer than he intended, telling himself it was just as steady as breathing. He woke. 2 voices. Not close, but closer than safety allowed. 2 men, speaking Somali, their footsteps crunching across debris as they approached the ruins. Cole's instincts snapped him awake, even through the haze of dehydration. His muscles screamed as he pulled himself behind a collapsed counter. The voices grew clearer. One was young, the other older, both speaking urgently. The words came fragmented through Cole's fogged mind, but he caught enough to understand the severity of his situation. They were looking for him. And the bounty had grown. He heard the phrase, "American soldier," repeated, followed by something that made his pulse spike despite the weakness consuming him. Maps worth more than gold. His mind sharpened. The malicious didn't believe he was just a stray operator. They believed he carried intelligence, maybe something intercepted during the chaos of the ambush. Whether true or not didn't matter. Belief was enough to turn the city into a hunting ground where every pair of eyes might recognize him. Information traveled fast in Mogadishu, faster than weapons, faster than fear. He forced himself to breathe silently as the footsteps entered the building. One pair approached from the front, the other from the back. Cole slid his hand to the combat knife sheathed against his vest. His MP5 felt too heavy to lift in his current state, and a gunshot of unsuppressed trisked, drawing an entire cell of fighters to his location. The knife was silent. Silent was life. As the first man stepped past the counter, Cole lunged upward with the last reserve of strength in his body, driving the blade beneath the man's ribcage and clamping a hand over his mouth. The second man shouted an alarm, raising his rifle, but Cole pulled the dying guard down with him, using the body as a shield. A bullet tore through the counter and ricocheted against the wall inches from Cole's arm. He let go of the first man, rolled sideways, and forced himself to his knees. The second fighter sprinted around the counter, rifle raised. Cole moved on instinct, raw and animal. He grabbed a broken shot of rebar from the floor and swung it upward, smashing it into the fighter's knee. The man faltered, cried out, and Cole seized the moment, wrenching the rifle from his hands and pulling the trigger once. The shot was muffled by the man's own body absorbing the blast. The body collapsed. Cole froze, listening for reinforcements. None kami. The city was loud enough that 2 isolated struggles could be mistaken for anything. He dragged the boaters deeper into the shadows, burying them beneath rubble. When he knelt to wipe the sweat from his face, his hand trembled violently. His breath was shallow. His heartbeat fluttered too fast. This was not fatigue. This was his body shutting down. He needed water, or he would be dead before nightfall. He moved toward the southern edge of the district, where rumor had said a rival militia controlled a small section of territory with access to wells. Unreliable, but water nonetheless. It was a gamble, but not gambling wasn't an option. Every step felt like lifting concrete. His head swayed, his vision doubled, then corrected, then doubled again. He stumbled into an alley where a group of children sat playing with bottle caps, but their eyes lifted in unison when they saw him. Their expressions were unreadable, but they didn't run. They simply watched him move, the way birds watch a predator that has already been injured. They knew, he could feel it. His identity was hidden only by exhaustion, not by skill. As he passed, one of the older boys stood and walked the opposite direction, disappearing behind a building. Cole understood instantly. The child was going to alert the nearest militia, time compressed into a single command. Move. Now, he pushed himself forward, fighting the dizziness, following the faint smell of dampness in the air, a sign of water somewhere nearby. The alley opened into a courtyard where a rusted well stood, its wooden lid cracked and partially open. The sight nearly made him collapse from relief. He stumbled toward it, dropped to his knees, and pulled the lid aside. Inside, dark water glimmered. Not clean, not safe, but wet. He lowered a small metal cup tied to the rope, brought it up, and drank greedily. The water tasted like rust and earth and mildew, and it was the most beautiful thing he had tasted in days. He cupped more in his hands, splashed it on his face, letting it run down his neck, feeling life crawl back into his veins. But survival never offered gifts without cost. As he wiped his face and rose unsteadily to his feet, he heard it, the echo of rapid footsteps entering the courtyard. Voices shouting, no more hesitation, no more whispers this time. The hunt was overt. The child had done his job. Cole looked around. No exits, except the way he came. No cover, except the well itself, no time to ruin. He steadied his stance, wiped the remaining water from his chin, and prepared to fight, not because he wanted to, but because Mogadishu demanded it. He had survived 3 days. 2 remained, and the city had begun to close its jaws. The moment the footsteps burst into the courtyard, Cole felt the shift in the air swift, violent, decisive. The hunters were no longer shadows or whispers. They were men with rifles raised, voices sharp with urgency, and the confidence of those who believed they had cornered their prey. Cole wiped the water from his mouth with the back of his hand, feeling the shock of clarity that hydration brought, even if only for a brief moment. His body remained weak, trembling from the edge of collapse, but his mind sharpened instantly. Survival had always been a negotiation between instinct and timing, and right now, instinct was the only advantage he had left. 3 militia fighters entered first, fanning out across the courtyard. Cole moved behind the stone well, the only cover available, its circular wall barely thick enough to shield him from direct fire. The first fighter shouted instructions, signaling for the others to flank. Cole glanced at the angles instinctively. If they reached the southwest corner, he would be exposed. He had one option: break their formation before they completed it. He waited, not out of hesitation, but calculation. He listened to their steps, counted the rhythm, measured the distance between breaths. When the closest fighters stepped within 3 paces of the well, Cole leaned out with the speed of a striking snake, firing a short burst. The suppressed MP5 coughed 3 times, and the man collapsed, his weapon clattering across the ground. The other 2 immediately returned fire, splintering the upper rim of the well with sharp, concussive cracks. Cole dropped to one knee, avoiding a shot that tore through the air exactly where his throat had been a second earlier. He leaned out again, far enough to put down the second fighter with 2 controlled shots. The third militia member dove behind a pile of debris and began shouting for reinforcements. Cole knew he had seconds, not minutes. More footsteps echoed down the alley. The child had brought a small army. Cole sprinted toward the fallen fighter and slid behind him, grabbing his AK and a half-full magazine from his vest. He kept low, internal vision narrowing to a tunnel as dehydration and adrenaline waged war in his bloodstream. More fighters entered the courtyard, 5, maybe 6. The alley behind them flickered with the shadows of more approaching. This was no longer a hunt. It was a closing net, Cole fired a burst toward the entrance to slow them, then pivoted toward a side wall where the plaster had crumbled away. He slammed his shoulder into it. It didn't give. He struck again. On the third hit, a section of the wall cracked, collapsing into a narrow gap leading to an adjacent building. He slipped through, just as rounds tore through the opening behind him. Inside the second building, darkness consumed him. Dust hung in the air like fog. The ground sloped downward into the remnants of what had once been storage rooms, now a labyrinth of debris. Cole moved quickly but carefully, listening as more fighters poured through the hole in the wall he had forced open. He needed elevation, distance, confusion. He needed to turn Mogadishu back into a maze. He climbed a broken staircase and emerged into a shattered room overlooking the street. Below, two rival militia groups were shouting at each other. Weapons raised not at him, but at one another. Cole dropped to his stomach, peering between fragments of wall. He realized instantly what was happening. News of the bounty had spread to multiple factions, and now they were disputing who had the right to claim it. Chaos, violence, opportunity. Gunfire erupted in the street as one militia opened fire on the other. Cole used the distraction to slide across the broken floor, jump onto a lower balcony, and drop silently into a narrow alley behind the compound. For a moment, the world blurred from dehydration, the edges of his vision swimming. He grabbed a rusted pipe for balance, forcing himself to stay upright. If he collapsed here, he would not rise again. He staggered toward a collapsed UN outpost 2 streets away, its once white walls now stained with soot and impact marks. Inside, he found temporary refuge behind a pile of sandbags, still arranged as if expecting a battle that never happened. He sank to the ground, chest heaving, vision flickering between clarity and darkness. He had made it through the courtyard, through the chase, through the crossfire, but his body was breaking faster than the city was. He leaned his head back against the sandbag's eyes, half closed, and for the first time since the mission shattered, he let a thought pass through him that he had fought relentlessly to avoid. I may not get out of here alive. The edges of his consciousness blurred, sweat cooled against his skin. The room shifted. A voice whispered his own name from somewhere distant. He reached for his weapon, but his arm barely responded. Then he realized the voice wasn't real. It was his mind beginning to fracture under exhaustion and dehydration. Hallucinations, one of the final warnings before the body starts shutting down. He forced his eyes open and cursed softly, grounding himself in the cold metal of the rifle across his lap. He couldn't afford to lose himself now. He was too close to the end, whatever that end would be. He pushed himself up, every movement a negotiation between pain and willpower, and scanned the outpost for anything usable. In a storage drawer half buried under debris, he found a cracked plastic container holding a quarter bottle of water. He opened it with trembling hands and took the smallest sip, letting it sit on his tongue before swallowing. Every instinct screamed to drink it all. Discipline forced him not to. Outside, Mogadishu roared with gunfire as factions battled over a prize they didn't understand. Cole wiped his face, steadied his breath, and prepared himself for the final 2 days. The city was tightening, but so was he. Cole awoke on the 4th morning with the unsettling clarity of someone who had drifted in and out of consciousness rather than slept. A dull light leaked through the fractured concrete walls of the abandoned UN outpost, casting pale slashes across the dust-filled air. His body felt heavier than the gear strapped to him, each limb stiff with dehydration and exhaustion. His throat raw and dry enough that every swallow felt like dragging sandpaper across exposed nerves. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had actually woken or if his mind was floating through another hallucination, but then he heard it, a faint, raspy burst of static that didn't he belong to Mogadishu's constant soundtrack of distant gunfire and restless voices. It was unmistakable. A radio. He forced himself upright, each movement slow and deliberate, and reached for the device with trembling fingers. Static crackled through the speaker, no words, just noise. But then, through the interference, a fragmented voice cut through the chaos like a thin wire in the dark. It wasn't Somali. It wasn't militia. It was English. "Oh, do you Copy. His chest tightened with something dangerously close to hope. He pressed the radio against a broken metal frame to use it as a makeshift antenna, willing the signal to strengthen as he forced his battered voice past a throat cracked from dehydration. "This is Cole," he managed, the words scraping out of him. "Do you copy?" He wasn't sure if they heard him, but he gave approximate coordinates anyway, based on memory and instinct, adjusting for the fluid borders and shifting front lines of the districts he had crossed. After that, the radio went silent again. No confirmation, no promise, just the ghost of a connection fading back into static. Extraction was now a possibility, but possibilities meant nothing in Mogadishu unless you lived long enough for them to matter. By mid-morning, the city had grown restless. The militias, having realized they had lost his trail, turned their frustration into action. Patrols expanded, orders were shouted across alleyways. Doors were kicked open, civilians were dragged from homes and questioned. The pressure in the air was palpable, as if the entire landscape was tightening around a single target. Cole slipped out of the UN outpost, moving with painful slowness through side streets and fractured buildings. His legs buckled more than once, his vision fading at the edges, forcing him to brace himself against walls still warm from the rising sun. He needed shelter. He needed to stay hidden. Needed time. By early afternoon, the heat was crushing. The sun scorched the concrete, turning the city into a furnace where even shadows felt hot. As Cole turned a corner, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. His legs trembled violently, forcing him to drop into a crouch just to stay upright. He pressed his hand to the wall, grounding himself, but the ground tilted regardless. The sensation stretched, deepened, threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He lowered himself slowly to the dirt, unable to stop the darkness sliding over his vision. He didn't know how long he lay there, staring at the sky through the jagged lines of shattered rooftops. Minutes, hours. Time dissolved. A single thought moved through him with quiet finality, not like 'tis. A death in an alley, alone and forgotten, claimed not by enemy fire but by thirst. That was not how he intended to be remembered. He rolled onto his stomach, pushed the earth away with shaking hands, and forced himself upright again. Survival wasn't an emotion or an instinct. It was a decision made repeatedly until the world bent. He staggered toward the southern edge of the district, where terrain sloped toward the old drainage canals, open enough for an extraction helicopter, concealed enough for special operations to approach. But Mogadishu had one final trial waiting. As Cole stepped into the open street, gunfire erupted from a doorway, bullets slicing the air. He dove behind a rusted generator, the impact rattling his bones. 3 fighters stormed out, firing controlled bursts. Cole returned fire, but his sight wavered, his aim slipping as dehydration blurred the edges of everything he saw. He grazed one attacker, sending him spinning, but the others advanced with brutal confidence. More shadows gathered behind them. Reinforcements, an entire cell converging on him. He braced himself behind the generator, breathing hard, counting rounds, and calculating failure. He pressed the radio again. Cole, Canals, Southwest District. If you hear me, now is the time. The reply was silence. More footsteps thundered toward him. Somewhere behind the haze, he felt the finality of it, that this might be the last street he ever saw. Then the world exploded with sound. A low, thunderous roar tore through the air, followed by a violent rush of wind that kicked dust and debris into a swirling cloud. Cole shielded his eyes as a helicopter descended through the haze, rotors slicing the air so close to the rooftops that tiles shook free and shattered on the ground. A voice boomed through the loudspeaker, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Cole, mauvais. Now. He pushed himself up, his legs barely obeying, and sprinted toward the descending rope. Bullets tore through the air around him, one grazing his shoulder and spinning him sideways. He collapsed, gasping, the rope swaying inches above his head. He reached for it, missed, reached again, and finally wrapped his fingers around it as more militants poured into the street, firing wildly. The helicopter began to rise, lifting him off the ground. Cole's grip slipped once, twice, but he held on until hands reached down and hauled him inside. The moment he touched the floor of the helicopter, his consciousness began to unravel. He heard shouting medics calling for fluids. Teammates demanding vitals heard the engine strain as the pilot pushed the aircraft away from enemy fire. His hearing dimmed, turning the world into a muffled hum. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was Mogadishu shrinking beneath him, a labyrinth of dust, violence, and fire that had almost erased him. 2 days later, Cole awoke in a field hospital with 4 lines in his arms and a medic sitting beside him. The debrief was clinical, brief, and cold. His radio message had been received only as a fragment. His survival was labeled unlikely but commendable. His decisions were marked adaptively, unconventional. The official report summarized his ordeal in 3 paragraphs, ending with a sterile line. Operators survived beyond expected operational thresholds, but the truth lived far outside those pages. Cole hadn't simply survived Mogadishu. He had walked through a city designed to devour men like him and had come out the other side bearing invisible scars that no briefing room could comprehend. No medals were pinned to his uniform. No reporters came for interviews. No one outside the unit ever heard the full story, and Cole preferred it that way. When younger operators later asked how he lasted 5 days alone in Mogadishu's deadliest districts, he never described the firefights, the hallucinations, or the moment he nearly died crawling toward the extraction rope. He simply sighed with quiet certainty. You don't survive 5 days alone. You survive one day, then you do it again, and again, and again. Because that was the truth behind the classified report. Cole didn't escape because he was stronger or faster or luckier. He escaped because he refused to disappear. 5 days, alone, and never forgotten.